Welcome everyone to our Better Works podcast. Today we are featuring David Houle, the Futurist. David Houle has a column in the Herald Tribune titled The Futurist. His 10th book is available now titled Cognitive Dissonance. He's the co-founder and managing director of the Sarasota Institute, which is a 21st century think tank that looks at 10 topics that will affect the Gulf Coast of Florida, the US, and the world. From speaking to or advising over 4,000 CEOs and business owners, David Houle is known as the CEO's Futurist and has won a Speaker of the Year award from Vistage International, the leading organization of global CEOs. David, I could go on and on. Your background is impressive. It's great to have you on our Better Works podcast to help us make sense of our current labor market problems. But before we jump into problem solving, David, help us to understand what a futurist is and what it is that you do.
Sure. People always say, well, what does that mean? So I'm a futurist, and I come from a long line, probably over the last 100 years, of people who look into the future, spot trends, analyze them, and then use those trends to kind of suggest forecasts and make predictions. So that's what I do. My job basically is to be a catalyst to get people to think about the future and then to facilitate a conversation about it. Because, I've found that most people really don't think about the future. They either make it personal, oh, it's my plans, or they think the future is really going to be bad, which is fairly widespread these days, or they don't think about it at all. So my job, and in a time such as now, the post-pandemic time in the 2030s, there's going to be so much change. I feel my responsibility is to prepare people for the change, because that's the best way to deal with change, is not to be surprised by it.
That does make a lot of sense. And it is excellent to prepare always. One of the things that I noticed on your website is that you have this really neat accountability timeline, where you hold yourself accountable for your projections. So how is it that you determine which historic or current events to incorporate in your projections?
Yeah, no, it's variable. I tend to, when I first became a professional futurist full-time in 2006, somebody said, so what forecasts have you made that have been proven true? I said, oh, that's what I need to do. So I'm the only futurist who I think has that up there. I need to update it. With COVID, I've let things slide a little bit in the website. I'm redoing it. But basically, I focus on what I know. So I, for some reason, I've always been right about the price of oil and energy. I've been right about technology and media, because I had 20 years in media and entertainment. But I look at things that I think are going to affect humanity more than other things. People have often said, oh, you're a futurist. You speak about the future of technology. And I go, no, I speak about how technology is going to change human behavior, because that's really the issue. In other words, you're involved in the workforce issues. How is technology going to change the workforce, right? That's more important than what's going to happen to technology. And how is COVID going to change the nature of employment in this area and around the world? Because it's going to. So I really try to, I'm not worried about politics as much. It does have an influence, but it's not so much about politics. It's about the big things, the cultural things, the technological things, healthcare, education, the economy. Those are the things that disproportionately affect our reality. So I try to, and I stay away from what I don't know. Like, for example, I mentioned I've been right about the price of oil for the last 15 years, but I don't understand natural gas as well, right? So I stay away from that.
That makes sense. Well, speaking of the state of the humanity, what we do here at CareerSource is we receive federal and state funds to help employers reduce the cost of recruiting, retaining, and also training their staff. Mm-hmm. And for job seekers, we provide grant funds to increase their employability and job readiness. So, although we're not a staffing agency during this COVID, pandemic, we've been slowly trying to match qualified job seekers with viable employers. And as you well know, there's a massive disconnect between employers and job seekers, and employers are complaining that no one's looking for work. They can't hire anyone, they can't find anyone, while job seekers are having a higher standard of living, collecting unemployment compensation. And they find it costs more, in fact, to work at a lower wage job when you factor in childcare and travel and other expenses. So,
well, yeah, I mean, I want to challenge that. I think it's an easy out for employers to say, well, and I'm going to call it out. I think the Republican Party is more this way than the Democratic Party in this state, at least. But to say that people aren't going back to work because they're getting unemployment, that's partially true. But as you said, women are not going back to work because it falls on women for child support, right? For childcare. And there's people who have been vaccinated, but they don't want to go expose themselves to people who haven't been vaccinated. And is it safe to go to work? And then there's a whole issue of, well, I've spent 15 months having a more integrated life working from home. Why do I want to come back to that? So, but the other thing, and this is where a trend I've studied, Hope, is since the Great Recession, when I've spoken to all these CEOs, they talk about how they're not given any raises and they've cut training and they've laid people off. And I said to them back in 2010, 2011, 2012, that's short-term thinking, because what's going to happen is the employment market's going to come back. And because you've gotten rid of training, people are going to leave because they'll get trained elsewhere. And then you're going to say to me, as they've been saying, we can't find qualified people. Well, you didn't keep them on and train them, right? In Germany, when the Great Recession happened, they kept all their employees. Most large companies kept all their employees. They cut their salary by a third, but they kept them employed. So, if you look at, and this better than anyone, if you look at the wages in the United States of America, they haven't gone up at all since the Great Recession. So the flip side to, well, people don't want to come back to work because they're unemployment, is you're not paying them enough to come back to work. What a statement does it make on the Gulf Coast economy to say people aren't coming back to work because they make more money on unemployment? Well, the flip side of that is, well, you're not paying them enough. If you can't pay them to compensate for unemployment, what do you don't care about people. You don't care about people. You don't care about their situation. You just want to hire people for as little as you can. And that, my friend, is not going to work in the 2020s United States of America, not with the new generations, not with diversity, not with women's empowerment. It's just not going to work.
Right. And I mean, we see the data speaking exactly to your point, that if it's more beneficial to not work and be more selective, then people are going to do that, because naturally it's about survival and they want what's best for themselves and their families. There is the labor market data that we've reviewed, and I'm really curious to get your perspective on this, because for the number one projected occupation in 2023 on this list from the Employ Florida website, it says it's retail salesperson. Number two would be waiters and waitresses. Three would be combined food preparation and servicing workers, including fast food. And the fourth are cashiers. And so we know these jobs typically don't pay living wages. And in your May 24th, 2021 Herald Tribune post, you, under the title Retail and Restaurants, you write, quote, both of these will contract as the move to online convenience and pickup will continue to increase, virus or not. Retail will become more of a display of products that can then be purchased online and delivered to the home, end quote. So on the one hand, we have a projected increase in the job growth within the retail and sales and service industries. Yet the pandemic has boosted the need to conduct such business online. So there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, that's why I asked you before we recorded this, whether you created that data or you got it from the state. You got it from the state. So, because the reason is, I looked at that, you sent it to me last week, and I looked at it again this morning. And to me, it rang of total lack of intelligence. In other words, somebody just did a spreadsheet and projected out percent increase to get to the end. It's somebody like was working on an Excel spreadsheet and they go, well, retail's always been number one. And so we'll continue that. And, all you got to do is get in a car and spend 45 minutes driving around this metropolitan area and tell me that you don't see any vacant restaurants. Tell me you don't see any open, available for sale or rent. Shopping centers are closing. I mean, it's ludicrous to think that's going to come back. It's a zero-sum game. I don't think retail or restaurants are going to grow at all in this market. For anyone that opens, one's going to have to close. And by the way, if you're not going to pay people, you're not going to get them, right? So why should I take I just want to put this stat on the record here. So I went back and I looked at the history of the minimum wage. The highest the minimum wage ever was relative to the cost of living at that time was 1968. It was $1.65. Okay. So I think the minimum wage here is what, $7.50? Is that right?
Like $8.65.
$8.65 in the state of Florida. Okay. So I did the math. I took the $1.65 and then I ran it through the inflation calculator. What would $1.65 translate into in 2021? And in 2020, I did this. It translated into $12.15, right? So the minimum wage should be $12.15, and that's assuming that that's a national average. So in places where the cost of living is higher, it should be more. So you could argue very easily that if you want to match $1.65 minimum wage in 1968, you got to be paying people $13. So I ask any employer who wants cashiers or restaurant help at less than that to look in the mirror and find the reason why they can't get people. I mean, if you can't, just think of that. $1.65 was equivalent to 12 and a quarter now, or 12.50 at this point in time. So $7.85. There's your answer, Yeah,
that completely makes sense. And that's exactly what we've been hearing. We work directly on the front lines, working directly with employers and job seekers. And I can tell you, David, from having long conversations with job seekers who are frustrated because they've been sending out their resumes and either they're not hearing anything back or they are, as I said, dissatisfied with the quality of the job market out there available to them. So,
and that I came down along with my wife, who's a therapist, and we gave a half-day seminar, and we were hugging people, and they were hugging us, and the despair, the lack of self-worth that people are forced to live with as they're looking for a job in this area, I just find inhumane. It's just, and that's what I was saying to them, that don't feel bad on yourself because you're not a failure. You just, for some reason, are unemployed. It's just like the homeless. The homeless are 2 or 3 bad decisions or bad events away from being homeless, right? They got a divorce and their house foreclosed on them, so they're homeless. That's not a reflection on the humanity of the individual or the quality. And I really, the interesting thing, Hope, is that all the work that I have done with corporations since COVID and all the research I've done shows that it's been a transformative event. Not just that we couldn't work and we couldn't buy and people were unemployed, but that people had time to realize meaning in their life or that they wanted to do something different. One of the stats that I think I mentioned in that article was that it's an unprecedented amount of new entrepreneurial jobs. And there's a correlation now to the stimulus, the 1.9 trillion and paying for child support and everything else. There's a correlation when those things were paid and the creation of new jobs. So if you are unemployed because you were let go and the employer didn't care to keep you at any reduced rate, and you didn't like the job anyway, and you started a new thing and you get to be at home with your family, that's another reason to not go back unless you're paid to compensate for giving up what you now want. So the whole world has changed. And I think, so that research I think, on the state of Florida website is just, it might have worked projecting forward from 2019. It no longer is at all valid. It really isn't. And I can speak at length about that.
It really does seem this way. And I really appreciate how you mentioned the aspect of this consciousness shift
Yes.
between the employers and how they are, becoming a little bit more empathetic, toward job seekers. And maybe that's something that we as a society could use a healthy dose of empathy.
Of course. I mean, what has happened in COVID, right? You have Black Lives Matter. That's huge. As somebody who, as I told you when I spoke last week, I drove 18 hours to go to Dr. King's funeral. I mean, that's huge. It's changed the game in race relations in this country and around the world. That's number one. Number two, isn't it interesting? And they're smaller countries, but the countries that have done best for COVID were all run by women. So, okay, so women empowerment. I mean, that's part of diversity. So, and then the other thing that's happened is skills came to the forefront, not education, because what the COVID did is showed how overpriced and underprepared higher ed is, right? So, you have Elon Musk saying, I don't hire people necessarily, they don't have to have college degrees. He said, there's a lot of people who graduate from Ivy League schools and they all report to me. I didn't graduate from Ivy League school. Bill Gates dropped out of college. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. So there's this whole new thing about questioning the value of overpriced college education. A college education has gone up more in cost since 1970 than anything else in the United States, including healthcare. And yet, as you know, the wages have increased like 2% in the time that college has gone up 20%, right? So there's that mix now too, which is it worth it getting a college degree and spending $250,000 or going into debt for that? I mean, think of all the college students who took on debt and then they lost their jobs in COVID. They're really in a difficult situation. Now, the debt shouldn't be forgiven necessarily, but employers need to understand this, right? I'm sorry to be so forceful, but
this is great.
The whole world has changed, and those research things that you sent me are just irrelevant.
I get that. And since we're speaking about education, I am very curious to know how you see the future of education as a player in the field of this labor market. What's the best way to serve the bulk of our job seeker industry? I mean, given the circumstances we are in right now.
Yeah, I mean, the loose cliche has been what 100 years ago would suffice with a high school diploma, you now need a college diploma for. I can understand that, but on the other hand, there's technology that didn't exist. So I think that education is going to be extremely disintermediated. When you can take a course of the greatest professors in the Ivy League on a video course, I wrote about this back in 2012. I said, if it's $250,000 to get a degree from MIT, or $25,000 to get a certificate from MIT, where you're taking online at your own pace and passing the exams and doing all the work of it being online, on YouTube, the difference between $250,000 and $25,000, let the market decide. Yeah. I mean, I absolutely think that what we have learned is that retail, entertainment, healthcare, and education were all eviscerated and shown to be deeply wanting with COVID, right? Education, we don't know how to do this. Well, why don't you know how to do it, right? You should have figured out online education, and the fact that you weren't prepared for it shows you aren't thinking deeply. The fact that the healthcare system wasn't prepared for a public health emergency shows that they weren't prepared. The fact that a third of all movie theater screens are going to close by the end of the year. I mean, it's not going back. There is no going back. I'm sorry. The one thing I want to say, because you made a reference of the new normal and things, but it is the phrase I've used, I think I wrote about in the Herald Tribune, is the light, vaccines, light at the end of the tunnel.
Mhm.
Well, the light at the end of the tunnel, we're emerging from the tunnel into the daylight, but it's a different daylight from which we entered the tunnel. So while we were in this tunnel, daylight and the world changed, and we're emerging into a new and different world. And I think employers, by the end of this summer, are going to realize that. They're going to realize that they can't get people without paying them what they're worth, that education is as important as skills, and that the most important thing for a corporation is culture. If you have culture, people won't want to leave, and it'll be easy to get people because they've heard that you got a great workplace. So you can pay people less if you got a good culture. So the way to deal with not wanting to pay more people is to create a great culture, create great benefits, give people days off, do all that stuff. But if they're not going to do it, they're not going to get good people.
That makes a lot of sense, David. Thank you for shedding additional light on this subject. It's very necessary and important to hear. David, you have an extensive background in advising CEOs, and given this gap, as you mentioned rightfully, between employers and job seekers, and even what consumers need and want, like, how do you envision us bringing these groups together? And does your new book, Cognitive Dissonance, answer this question?
Well, I'll start with the second part of that. Cognitive dissonance. Okay, so I'm writing a series of books on the 2020s because this decade, as I realized about 5 years ago, is going to be a singularly important decade. It's a historical inflection point. So I decided, it doesn't matter what I say about the 2030s and 2040s. It's what humanity, what the Gulf Coast, what individuals do between now and 2030 that will set the trajectory, at least the 2050, if not for the whole century, right? So cognitive dissonance is basically, and the reason it started, I think, to sell well out of the gate is that it describes what people, the mindset or the state of being that they're in. In other words, this is the reality I believed, and this is the reality it is, and I'm having trouble reconciling this. So relative to employment, it's like, this is what I thought I would need to do to hire people, and now it doesn't work. So what the people say, well, it must be because they're getting unemployment. They have to go to something that allows them to understand the dissonance, and that's not the answer. So cognitive dissonance is the ability to stand in multiple realities or two different, seemingly opposite realities at the same time. And so I think you're going to see it, and we're talking about this now because I think that people looking for jobs really don't know what they're going to find or what they really want now, given COVID. And people who are trying to hire people have to understand that the employable pool of people has changed, and they have to change with it. And what was the first part of your question?
The first part of the question was, how can employers, job seekers, and even the needs of consumers, like, how can we bridge these major gaps that have been exposed during
by the two important qualities for the 2020s for people in business is being adaptive and being resilient. So the first thing an employer has to do is to be adaptive to the two market situation. And the first thing a person looking for a job has to be is adaptive to the situation. And what you're seeing is people are being adaptive to the situation and going, I'm not going back to work for $7.85. I'm not, right? I'm just not, right? I've cut my cost of living, everything else. So I think that it's only going to be through time that people will figure this out. And so there always comes a point in change. People don't like change, although change is the only constant in the universe. So I've been saying, one of the things I wrote about in that book is how to stand in change, how to live in change. Because if you can't, you're going to fail. you'll be out of business. You won't have a job, whatever it is this decade. So you have to be adaptive and you have to be resilient. So employers have to be adaptive to the new realities, and job seekers have to be resilient to staying in the game, number one, but also thinking that maybe what they did, they don't want to do anymore. So this is a great time for people to start over on both sides of the employment. I'm going to change my prerequisites for coming to work for our company. And also I'm going to change what I need for a job. So for example, some of the big Silicon Valley companies, when they went virtual, like Facebook, for example, and I think Google did this, if people went back home or they went back to the country or they went to a nice place to work and the cost of living was less than the New York or less than the San Francisco, what those companies did was they stopped paying them the salary that they needed to pay to have people show up at the office in Silicon Valley or in Wall Street, and they paid them less based on where they lived. So one of the things that's going to happen is that companies have a lot of employees who have allowed to work remotely and perhaps pay them less are going to be confronted with the reality, do I really want to pay them more to have them come back to work? So there's so many dynamics that have changed that, and I'm really glad to be having this conversation with you, because I think the people who are looking are more aware of the reality than the employers right now, because the employers are thinking, well, this is the way I used to run my business, and so this is the way I'm going to run it now. And the people have felt the change, right? They've gone through the transformation. They've realized that they like being around their kids during the day. They've realized that not having to commute and all that friction and cost and time is not worth it anymore. So I think one of the things I do want to say is employees, and I wrote that column, right? I mean, the employees, it's not all work from home or all work from the office. So if speaking to the employer now, if you got somebody you really want to hire and they want to work from home, maybe you can pay them less and they'll work from home. That's the way you work through it.
So thinking more creatively.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a motivated employee who feels respected and liked amongst their fellow people in the company will always outperform somebody who doesn't feel they're liked and feels resented. So right now, the humanity first is a hashtag I keep using. It's much more about humanity now than about left brain, math.
Agreed. Because if someone feels, if a student, for instance, referring to math, feels respected and cherished and liked by the teachers and the students, then he or she will perform much better, statistically speaking, on that math test than someone who feels disliked or disrespected by their teacher or classmates.
Right, exactly right. And we know this, right? We just know this. So I think that I want any employer who would listen to this podcast to hear the following statement. It's a whole new ball game. Culture is really important. Self-worth and humanity first will make you a place that people will want to work for. If you're all about the money, you will not get the quality, and people who you hire just for the money are going to leave just for the money. If you make it about money and payment, you're going to lose that game, because that worked maybe in the Great Recession, but it's not working now.
Well said. The Economic Development Council determines what labor market opportunities are needed in the area. Do you see a relationship between what you do as a futurist and the Economic Development Council? And, if so, what role might that be?
I would love to be involved with that. I mean, I've written some columns. I mean, I think one of the things, if Sarasota County was one of the counties that had the most number of people moving into it during COVID, because it's a nice place to live, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, but these were the affluent. So until there's going to be an issue in the Gulf Coast for affordable housing. If you want to keep the young people here, you got to find places for them to live. If you want to have people who are talented, you got to give them a culture. So you got to have affordable housing, more flexible work rules, more understanding that Sarasota County say, which I know a little bit better than Manatee, Sarasota County is not a real solid market because so many people come down here for part of the year and they expect for the services, but where are those people who provide the services going to live for when the people are down here? And then when the people go back, there's less of a demand on all the businesses. So until this becomes less seasonal, I think it's about ready to become less seasonal because COVID has triggered that. And until there is more affordable housing and affordable lifestyle culture, there's always going to be this imbalance. And I mean, where do restaurant workers live? Where do retail workers live? You want a cashier for $8 an hour? Where's he or she going to live?
Very true.
Right. If you can't answer that question, then don't demand people to come to work for you that way. Right.
Very true. I mean, a 1-bedroom apartment will cost you at least $1,100, $1,200 in Sarasota.
Right. And then you add on electric and cable. So you're at $1,500. So that's $50 a day. Okay. And a 30-day week, a 30-day month. Sorry. $50 a day. You work 8 hours. Even if you get $10 an hour, that's $80. So you're giving, 65% of your gross income to housing. It's just, the rule of thumb is you shouldn't spend more than a third for housing. So if you're spending $1,000, you're spending $1,500 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment with utilities, you should be making $4,500, which is basically a $50,000 salary.
Right.
And if you can't do that, you're forcing people to not live the way they want to live. And that's what's happening now.
Right. And that's a very stressful way to live.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we all know those statistics. And you see people in the door, the average American family has $400 in savings.
Right.
They're one critical car breakdown or medical bill away from bankruptcy.
Right.
I mean, this is the United States of America. It's not right. This is not right. And that's the big issue. Employers are going to have to be more interested in the well-being of their employees, not just in how little they can pay them.
Agreed. Thank you so much for this insightful conversation, David Houle. Where can our listeners get more information on what you're doing, what you're up to? How can they get in touch with you?
So my website, which is going to be redone this summer, so to me it's out of date, is davidhoule.com. So it's DAVIDHOULE.com. Every other Monday, I write for the Sarasota Herald Tribune. Just go to the Herald Tribune and type in The Futurist. That's the name of my column. And all my books, I've written 11 books now. They're all on Amazon. Just type in David Houle books and you get them. And these books that I'm writing about the 2020s, they're short, 120 pages, 3-hour read, and I price them inexpensively. You can get for $6, you can get an ebook. For $15, you can get a print book. So I tried to keep the cost low. I'd rather have people. These books I'm writing, by the way, I hope are the books that I think as a futurist are most relevant because they're applicable today. You read Cognitive Dissonance, you read the most disruptive decade in history. It will help you today, this week, and this year, right? And so I find as a futurist, the future has moved into the now. So now is the time that the future is being created. So sorry to go off on that, but davidhoule.com, Amazon, David Houle Books, and the Sarasota Herald Tribune.
Thank you so much, David Houle. We look forward to hearing from you again.
Okay.
You're welcome back anytime.
Okay, absolutely. And you do good work, and I'm happy to support you any way I can, Hope. You be well.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.